All right, thanks very much. It's really exciting to be here tonight. I'm really happy to be able to join you all virtually, um, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Now, I'm going to be talking about the book that my brother Ken and I we co-authored together. It's been out now for almost 2 years, which seems hard to imagine, for me at least. But the presentation tonight is sort of a journey through the book. And the first little bit, I'm going to tell you about how the book came to be. Um, and then the second part, which is sort of the more the meatier part, I guess, is like a virtual tour of four of the chapters of our book. So, um, yeah, we were super excited that we were able to put this book together. Um, and so sit back and enjoy. It should be about an hour or so. So before I tell you too much about the book, I just want to tell you about how it came to be. And the story starts with Ken and I as little kids being super interested in birds. And if we were doing this as a in-person presentation, I'd quiz you all to see if you could guess what bird we're looking at in this picture. That's me on the right looking through the scope, and then Ken's there looking through binoculars, and that's my dad in the hat looking on. And we're looking at a bird that we were chasing. This was a little over 20 years ago now, at the start of August in the year 2000, just outside of Delaware, Ontario. So let you rack your brains, see if you can think of what bird that is. And if you guessed Anhinga, you're right. We were looking at an Anhinga that spent a good chunk of the summer there. And this photo was taken by Ethan Malig, and it shows Ken and I. We were already hooked on birds by this point. I was about 15, Ken was about 13, and we were super obsessed with birds already. For me, I've always been interested in birds. My parents claim that I came out of the womb with a pair of binoculars in hand. Ken, though, he was the late bloomer of the two of us. And it wasn't until 1997, and we were out birding near where we grew up, just outside of Waterloo, and we found a prothonotary warbler. And we used to kind of have to drag Ken birding. We'd go on family trips to Point Pelee every spring, and Ken would usually get tired of it pretty quick. I like to make sure everybody knows that he was sort of the late comer to birding in our family. But when he saw his prothonotary warbler, he got absolutely obsessed with birds. So it was his spark bird, and that bird really led us down a pretty interesting path when it comes to birds. Ken started doing all sorts of research about prothonotary warblers, and we found out not only was it really rare to see one in Waterloo region, it was an endangered species in Canada, and it still is today. But Ken did lots of research, and he found out that you can build nest boxes for prothonotary warblers. So we got in touch with John McCracken at Bird Studies Canada then, and he gave us the designs for how to build prothonotary warbler nest boxes. And the next spring, we had a carload full of prothonotary warbler nest boxes that we drove down to Long Point to deliver for the recovery program. And when we got down to Long Point, Ken and I were just totally blown away, because we found out that there was this thing called a bird observatory, and there was people that got paid to look at birds and to think about birds and study birds. And we met all these amazing people that were just so encouraging of our interest that it really hooked us even more than we already were. So from there, we just have been obsessed with birds. We've been birding ever since, kind of across the province. We've sort of eat, sleep, and breathe birds, a lot of it. And that's a picture there of Ken and I with my dad on a trip on Lake Ontario, looking for yagers and gulls out on the lake a few falls ago. So we're still birding all over the place. We've sort of covered the province from corner to corner, and we've been lucky enough to be able to do that for fun, but also Ken and I have both taken it up as part of our careers. So you're probably wondering now, how did these two little geeky kids that were obsessed with birds, how did they come to write this book? Well, it was really a bit of good luck, as a lot of things in life are. We basically were just lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, and the publisher had done a version of this book, The Best Places to Bird in British Columbia, a couple of years earlier. And the authors of that, Dick and Russ Cannings, suggested that Ken and I might be willing to do an Ontario version. So we were asked, and of course we were interested at first, but we also were a bit hesitant because we grew up with this book, Bird Finding Guide to Ontario by Clive Goodwin, and I'm sure a lot of you own multiple copies of this book like we do. And we were sort of thinking we were being asked to do an updated version of this book, and with families and with full-time jobs, that was going to be a pretty daunting task to do in the time frame that the publisher was proposing. This book is just so jam-packed full of information that it would really be hard to do by two people alone. It would really take a whole birding community to update it. But we got our copies of Best Places to Bird in British Columbia, and we were really excited when we got it, because we saw that it was a bit different than the bird finding guide for Ontario. It wasn't just a sort of encyclopedic listing of every place that you might go looking for birds. Instead, it was a lot more in depth on fewer places. So didn't cover every single place in the province, but it covered the sort of favorites of the authors in British Columbia. And then because there was fewer places covered, it was able to go into a lot more detail about those places and talk about some of the stories of birding in those places and what are some of the interesting strategies and things like that. So it was a really exciting format that we thought we could do a really interesting version of for Ontario. So once we had agreed, that's when the work really started. And the first big hurdle we had to get over was, how the heck do you pick 30 places in Ontario? It's a huge place, and it's hugely variable. There's birds right from the south to the north. So that was a big part of the challenge. The province is just so big. It's about 1 million square kilometers, and it varies from the southern habitats like the Great Lake shorelines and the deciduous forests that you find there. And you keep moving north into central Ontario, and you get into the transition zone of the southern shield, onto the Canadian Shield, where the coniferous forest starts to take over, and you get these huge amounts of really interesting small wetlands, beaver ponds, things like that. And you keep going north, and you head up into the boreal forest and all the interesting birds and places that come with the boreal forest. And then, most people sort of think that's where Ontario ends, but if you go far enough north, you actually even get into some tundra areas, like this photo here on Hudson Bay. So it's really kind of mind-boggling when you think about how big Ontario is and how variable it is from south to north. Now, to make matters even more complicated, Ontario is really at sort of crossroads of all these bird highways. This map from National Geographic I really love, because it doesn't super oversimplify the migration routes that birds take. A lot of maps just show a lot of maps like this just sort of show a few major flyways, like the Pacific or West Coast Flyway, and then the Central Flyway or Mississippi Flyway, and then the Atlantic or Eastern Flyway. And you can kind of see those three major flyways on this map, but as you can see, there's variable routes all over the continent. But what you can notice in this, from looking at it from an Ontario's perspective, we really get birds from the central flyway and the eastern flyway, but all these birds that kind of have different routes. We get birds coming from the Arctic that pass through Ontario. We get birds that breed in northern Ontario and birds that breed in the south. So we've really got a really interesting mix of birds that come through the province. And we've already got some pretty amazing sites identified in Ontario for their importance to birds. There's the BirdLife Important Bird and Biodiversity Area program that's for Ontario is coordinated by Birds Canada. And as part of that program, we already have a number of sites, mostly situated along the shores of the Great Lakes and Hudson and James Bay, where birds naturally concentrate. But we have a number of sites already designated as really important sites for birds. So we kind of drew on all those pieces of information, and we started building our list of places. And of course, we ended up with a list of like 100 or 150 places, and we were being told we needed to have only 30 in the book. So that's where the second big challenge started coming from, which was how the heck do you whittle down that number down to just 30? So it was really tough because the whole time we were whittling away sites, we knew we were whittling away other people's favorites, and we knew every time we took away one of those, that meant somebody was going to be disappointed that we didn't include their favorite site. And if that's one of you, you can be rest assured we did it just so that your favorite site wouldn't become overcrowded with so many people coming. So we were really actually doing you a favor. Just keep that in mind. But in all seriousness, we whittled our sites down, and then we had to take into account things like where the readers were going to be and where it's most easily accessible. So that's why you see a concentration of our final site selection in southern Ontario, kind of places that are within a couple-hour drive of the GTA and Ottawa and sort of London to Windsor corridor. But as it happens, that corridor is some of the most important sites for bird concentrations in Ontario anyways, with the lower Great Lakes and their concentrating effect. So we ended up with 30 sites. We made sure to include some sites sort of all corners of the province. And we were finally happy with the list. We did have to get a little creative for some of those sites. We kind of cheated a little bit and combined a couple sites in single chapters. Just don't tell Greystone that we cheated a little bit. So that's kind of how the book came to be. It took us a couple of years to go from the get-go to the finished product. It included about a year of us just writing the content and getting together the maps and the photos and things like that. And then probably close to a year of back and forth editing with a variety of editors. So it was a fair bit of work, that's for sure, especially as we were doing it. The toughest part was having to go and do a whole bunch of research and go birding at all these places. It was tough to handle, but Ken and I were pretty hard workers, so we managed to get it done. So that's how we finished with our 30 sites. And then the way the book is set up is each chapter is one of those sites, and we really enjoyed writing the chapters because we got to sort of write a history of what the birding is like, what makes the site so great for birds and birding, and then there's a bit of a section on directions and how to get there. But the most fun section for each chapter was the birding strategy, and that's sort of like the largest chunk for each chapter, and it's sort of us taking you along and telling you how, if we were going to be birding there, how we would go about it and what we would focus on and what's the best strategy for finding the hard to find species and also just finding the most species. So the second part of the presentation tonight, as I promised, was is going to be a sort of virtual tour of a few of those chapters. So let's move along to do some actual birding. So of course it's fitting for us to start our tour at Long Point, since that's where Ken and I got our start to become serious birders. We go from just those geeky kids to trying to turn birding into a bit of our career. So you've got the map from the satellite imagery showing the base of Long Point, and I'll switch over to, there's the map that shows up in our book. Now, the really astute people on the presentation tonight, you'll notice there's something missing here, and that's the outer tip of Long Point. And this was one of these hard decisions we had to make writing the book. So Long Point continues another 20 kilometers or 15 kilometers to the east of where the laser is right now. But most of that is off limits to the public. Most of it is either privately owned or part of a national wildlife area that has no public access. There's a small field station at the very tip, which can be visited, although it's mostly underwater these last couple of years with the high water on Lake Erie. And that's where Long Point Bird Observatory runs their tip field station. But because it's pretty much it's pretty difficult to get out there, so that's why we decided to focus more on the base of the point and the mainland. So Long Point overall is got to be one of the best, if not the best, all-around birding sites in the whole province. It kind of gets overshadowed by Point Pelee, and that's fair. Point Pelee is a little easier, I think, for people to go birding at, just because it's a more compact chunk of geography. But Long Point, I think, has more stuff to offer at more times of the year, to be honest. Although I will happily go birding any day of the year at Point Pelee as well. So whenever we go to Long Point, we always start at the Old Cut field station. So to get there, you're going to come out of Port Rowan and make a left and go south on Highway 59. We call that the Causeway. It separates the inner bay from Big Creek Marsh on the west, and then it makes a 90-degree turn once you get across the marsh, and you go through the little town of Long Point, which is all little tiny cottages. There's a nice sandy beach all along here, and we'll zoom in on the Old Cut area. And if you make it to Long Point Provincial Park, that means you've gone too far. But you want to make a little left on Old Cut Boulevard, which is the second last road on the left before you get to the provincial park. I'm going to switch over now to the imagery again. And usually the first time people visit Old Cut, they're quite surprised because it doesn't really look like a whole lot, and you can be forgiven for kind of being surprised that this is a world-class birding site. But what it is it's this little cottage right here, and that cottage is the public banding station of the Long Point Bird Observatory. And this little tiny woodlot back here, again, it doesn't look like much. It's mostly kind of ratty poplar and Scots pine plantation. But that little woodlot has got a bigger bird list than almost anywhere else in the entire province. And so it's a pretty amazing spot. There's a little parking lot across the road. You can park, and then you walk across. Right here where my laser pointer is, there's the little banding lab. And the great part about going to Old Cut to start your list or start your day, there's a bird sightings board there. If banding is running, banding runs basically from the start of April till early June in the spring, and then early August to early November in the fall. And it runs every morning, weather dependent, of course, basically from sunrise till noonish. So if you head there and it's during banding season, you can just walk right up to the banding lab and take a seat, and the banders, if you're lucky, they'll bring you birds just like this Kentucky warbler. Now, obviously, you're not going to get a Kentucky warbler every time, but you can get lucky. And the great thing is you can just have a seat and they'll keep bringing surprises out of these little tiny bags, which they keep the birds in while they're waiting to be banded. You can sit there all morning if you want. You don't even need to lift your binoculars and rack up a pretty sweet bird list. And the whole time you're there, you can chat up the banders and find out what other birds have been seen. And so you can get all the tips you need before heading out. Now, once you're ready, you can go for a walk through the woodlot. The woodlot's awesome for warblers and other sort of forest songbirds. And then you can keep walking towards the provincial park. I usually go for a big walk when I'm at Old Cut, especially if it's during spring or fall migration. Do the woodlot and then head over to the provincial park and go for a longer walk there. In the park, there's marshes to the north, and there's some forest in the main part, and then the lake on the south. So you can get a good mix of birds, and you're quite likely to hear and see winnowing Wilson snipes like this guy, as well as a pretty good list of like pretty well any kind of bird you could want to see. There's the opportunity for shorebirds and gulls on the beach. There's all the marshes, so all the marsh birds on the north, and then there's woodland birds and even open country species like bluebirds and field sparrows, because there's some pretty big open areas around the campgrounds and things like that. So you can spend a whole morning doing that walk if you want, but there's lots of other places to check out. We usually start heading back up towards the causeway, and if you're there in duck season, so late fall till the bay freezes over, and then in spring from when the bay opens back up to sort of mid to late April is duck season. And if you're there in duck season, you want to stop at the Inner Bay viewing stand, where my little marker is here. It's just a little viewing tower, but it'll give you a spectacular view. And during duck season, the numbers of ducks in Long Point really are incredible, and they're not really rivaled by too many other places in the province. The bay is super productive for food for ducks, and the numbers of things like canvasback in the front here and redhead in the back and scaup, widgeon, basically you can find any kind of duck here that's possible in Ontario, but you can get tens of thousands of some of these species. The canvasbacks kind of max out around 10,000. Redhead, there's regularly 40 or 50,000 redheads in the bay, and kind of similar numbers of scaup. So it's pretty astounding, these huge numbers of ducks that you can come across when you're viewing the Inner Bay. Now, one of the things that Long Point is most famous for is another type of waterfowl, and that's tundra swans. Now, tundra swans, they have a pretty amazing migration. In North America, it's probably close to half of the population cuts through sort of southwestern Ontario, and Long Point's right dead in the middle of their migration route. So you could get 20 or 30,000 swans over a season easily. Probably double that. Most years go through the area, and it's not uncommon to get a flock of 10,000 swans, tundra swans, sitting in fields around the Long Point area in a single day. So it's definitely one of those sites. When it comes to birds in Ontario, you really have to go experience at least once. But most people end up that live close enough. They do it every year at least once, and so it's a bit tricky because the timing of the migration in the spring really depends on ice and snow levels. So you really got to sort of time it properly. But if you're there in sort of the last 2 weeks of March and there's open water on the bay, you should be there for a good number of tundra swans. And they'll often spend the night out on the bay and then head out to farm fields and feed on like corn stubble fields during the day. And with the swans, you're also likely to see good numbers of sandhill cranes down at Long Point. I took this video a few years ago, and it's what I assume is a male trying really hard to impress a female. As you can see, she's not really that impressed, but he's trying hard, so you got to give him credit for that. But sandhill cranes are definitely a favorite bird of people birding down at Long Point, and you can see in the back there's actually swans in that field. But cranes breed year round, or breed during the summer in the big marshes at Long Point, so you can see them all year. And as long as there's some open water remaining in the winter, there will even be cranes there in the winter. And over the last few years, the numbers of wintering sandhill cranes, especially at least up until most of the bay freezes in late fall, like late November, early December, it's pretty impressive. It could be 1,500 or 2,000 or even more sandhill cranes in the area. So definitely another sort of target bird if you're there in any time of year, but the big numbers are there mostly in late fall. Now, Long Point is obviously great. As I've told you, it's really great in spring and fall migration. It's great. There's interesting things to see in the winter, but in the summer, it's also got some pretty spectacular birds. Long Point is sort of known as the hotspot for Carolinian breeding birds in Canada. So these are the southern deciduous forests that sort of make the forests basically get to like Hamilton and southern Waterloo region, and London is about as far north as these forests go. And there's a whole suite of breeding birds that's their entire range in Canada, just that little sliver of Ontario. So the sort of most iconic, I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but one of the most common of these Carolinian breeding species down at Long Point is the hooded warbler. And these guys were actually formerly a species of special concern, but they've increased to the point that they were removed from that list several years ago. And you don't have to drive around too long in the Long Point area in the summer to understand how much they've increased. If you know their song and you're driving around with your windows open, they're in almost every woodlot that's in the Long Point area. So if you're there in June, during the breeding season, or late May, you have a really good shot at finding a hooded warbler, but you really want to beef up on your birding by ear to be able to recognize them by song. Now, much rarer in the Long Point area, but and Canada in general, is the Acadian flycatcher. Not as much to look at as the hooded warbler, but still a spectacular bird, and one that just barely gets into Canada. And basically your best bet to find one in anywhere in Canada is to go birding at Long Point and try some of the woodlots on the mainland of the Long Point area. And again, you want to listen for their song. So I think I've convinced you, I hope I've convinced you anyways, that Long Point should be near the top of your list for birding when you're able to head out and go birding somewhere. It's really a great place to go at any time of year. My favorite is still spring and fall migration, but it's got great winter birding and great summer birding as well. All right, we're gonna move just a little west on our map to that number 10 there. That's circled. Long Point is that one just to the east, and you can see how that super long spit of Long Point. But we're going to talk about this one, chapter 10, which is one of these cheater chapters that I told you about, because we kind of combined a few different areas into a single chapter. So this is the chapter is called Port Stanley to Port Burwell. So there's Port Stanley in the west, Port Burwell in the east, and then right in the middle is Port Bruce. So we combine these three areas into a single chapter. They're all kind of similar, offer similar types of birding and target species. And this is unlike Long Point, which is a super well-known spot. This chapter, this part of the province, is, I would say, one of the most underbirded parts of at least southern Ontario. So if you're looking for a less birded place, I would highly recommend the places I'm going to talk about in this chapter. So birding in this area between Port Burwell and Port Stanley, I always really love it in the winter. That's sort of the time of year I think most about this spot, but it's probably not the time of year it's most famous for. But in winter, you get a lot of lingering species. It's pretty far south in the province, so naturally it's a little warmer, and the lake moderates things a bit. So you get some lingering things. Lingering species like northern saw-whet owls and long-eared owls can be found in some of these, especially near the lake, in woodlots with lots of conifers that border on old scrubby fields. So you got to look hard for these guys, but they're around and in this area for sure. Other lingering species like fox sparrows and eastern towies and other types of sparrows are around here in much better numbers than even if you go half an hour, 40 minutes further north to a place like London. You have a much harder time finding these things. So it's really fun, I think, to drive these back roads down in this area during the winter time and keep an eye out for species like fox sparrows. Now the area, even though I said it's not super well known to birders, it's certainly got a long list of rarities that have shown up in the area. This photo here, which is spectacular, I know, is a black-throated gray warbler, and believe it or not, this is the very first photo I took with my first digital SLR camera. So that's why it's such an awesome photo. But this was a really big rarity that showed up at Port Burwell Provincial Park. That's about 15 years ago or so. If you want a better look at what one looks like, there's a little better photo. This is another black-throated gray warbler that I took a few years ago. And as you can see, I have actually figured out how to use a camera since I got it. So it's great for rarities. Tons of super rare stuff has shown up all along the lake here. But it's also a great place to be birding along the lake. You can find a wide range of ducks like white-winged scoter at some of the places like the Port Burwell Pier. But there's a good mix of ducks that you can find, especially in spring and fall migration. And speaking of migration, it's a super hot spot all along the lake, but places like Port Burwell and Port Stanley, Port Bruce, little features that stick out in the lake are there, and they're concentrating birds in migration. So something like yellow warblers, but warblers in general and songbirds in general are abundant in migration in this area. So great place to come get away from the crowds of Peely or Rondo or Long Point. And you can have a huge chunk of area all to yourself looking for these migrants. And just like Long Point, it's got some interesting breeding species. It's very close to Long Point, so it's got a lot of those same Carolinian species breeding in some of the inland woodlots and things like that. But on top of the species like hooded warbler and Acadian flycatcher, you're in a good spot to find things like yellow-throated vireo and these other sort of southern stuff. Now, the fall is excellent time to be birding this part of the province, and there's some pretty great concentrations of gulls and shorebirds. There's really nice beaches at Port Burwell and Port Stanley, Port Bruce, and along those beaches you can get big numbers of gulls, big numbers of Bonaparte's gulls, and with them are every year some little gulls, which have got to be pretty high up there on my list of all-time favorite bird species in the province. Ontario is really the best place in all of North America to see this species. Long Point gets good numbers. Port Burwell and Port Bruce and Port Stanley to a somewhat lesser degree, but all along this chapter's worth of lakeshore, you have a good shot at finding some little gulls. And it's also, as I said, along the beaches, you're quite likely to find some shorebirds. Out on the piers, you can get some. This is a semi-palmated sandpiper, and there's even a sewage lagoon at Port Stanley that is more of a duck sewage lagoon, but you can get good numbers of shorebirds there sometimes, especially if the water is low. Now, as I said, fall is a great time along the lakes, along this part of the province, and probably this is what this area is known most for. This chapter includes Hawk Cliff, and that's one of the places in the province where we get to see our biggest numbers of raptors moving through, like this golden eagle. And to understand why it's such a great place for migrating raptors, you have to sort of back out and look at the province as a whole, and look at the shape of the Great Lakes. And you need to know that most raptors, they really don't like flying across water. They depend on doing lots of gliding to conserve energy, and they do their best gliding when they have updrafts to get height, and then sort of glide from one updraft to the next. And those updrafts we don't really get over water so much. We get more updrafts over land, where the ground heats up quickly from the sun, creates the rising air. And so that's part of the reason that raptors don't really like to go out over water. So if you look at southern Ontario, and then you think about, if a raptor is trying to go from north to south, what route is it going to take? So I've drawn on some arrows here, and you can see if that water is acting kind of as a barrier, you get a huge chunk. All these birds sort of from the east side of Lake Superior to the east end of Lake Ontario, they all get funneled into that little tiny bit of southwestern Ontario and the north shore of Lake Erie. And right where that star is where Hawk Cliff is, in pretty well the middle of this chapter. So because of that, we get these extraordinary concentrations of hawks. And if you're there on a good day, you might see a kettle of broad-winged hawks or other hawks, and just get a spectacular show of 10 or 20,000 birds passing over, 10 or 20,000 raptors going over in a single day, which is, again, it's right up there with the 10,000 tundra swans as far as Ontario birding spectacles go. So again, you've got Long Point, you've got the Port Burwell, the Port Stanley chapter, both fantastic birding sites. So I hope you've made some notes, and you're going to plan your next couple of years worth of trips accordingly. So we're gonna move quite a bit further north now, to the sort of western corner of Ontario, to the Rainy River area. So this is not a day trip from southern Ontario, that's for sure. It's right on the corner of Minnesota and Manitoba, basically. But this is like such a unique area of the province when it comes to birding, that you really can't miss this spot at some point in your birding life, if you're interested in Ontario birds. So the map here is focused on the town of Rainy River right here. There's Windy Point on Lake of the Woods up at the top part of the map, and as you can see, we've got the border of Minnesota and Ontario that follows the Rainy River. So, and Manitoba is off over this direction, and then Thunder Bay is several hours to the east. So what's so interesting about this area as a birder, is you've got this really, really neat mix. So it's most famous for Ontario birders for birds that kind of have a western affinity. It really feels like you're on the edge of the prairies here. So you get, as soon as you get there, you're going to find tons of American white pelicans basically everywhere you go. In Ontario, it's like 95% of the pelicans that nest in the province nest on Lake of the Woods, and they're constantly flying over the town and up and down the river. So you won't have to go very far to find some pelicans. Whereas, we get quite excited if we see a single pelican in southern Ontario. Now, similarly, you won't have to drive far if you're there, at least if you're there in spring to fall, to find this species, Brewer's blackbird. And this is really a very common species. If you're driving along any of the sort of open agricultural areas, you'll see sort of every other fence post with a male Brewer's blackbird singing away. And again, they're much more common if you go further west from Ontario, but in Ontario, they're very hard to find. There's a few on the Bruce Peninsula and around sort of the Sault Ste. Marie area. But other than that, you really got to go to the Rainy River area to see them with any regularity. And it's the same thing with black-billed magpie. Again, you can obviously tell this is one of my photos. But the black-billed magpie, again, is a common bird out west. But in Ontario, it's basically Rainy River and that's it. But here, you pretty well are guaranteed to see magpies if you're out for any more than a couple hours driving around. And they're pretty spectacular birds, that's for sure. And one of my favorite things to see when I'm in the Rainy River area are the sharp-tailed grouse. And if you're there in the spring, you can get up super early and drive around and watch for them in the fields. And the males will put on this amazing display where they're displaying to the other males and trying to impress the females. But it's a really, really cool bird. But it's basically a bird of the prairies that just makes its way into Ontario in that little sliver of Rainy River. And even if you're not there in the spring, you have a good shot at finding sharp-tailed grouse. Just driving around, you'll see flocks of them out in the fields or crossing the roads and things like that. So they're pretty common in the area. Now, the clay-colored sparrow is another sort of western bird. This is much more common than those last few species in southern Ontario. But out in Rainy River, it's absolutely abundant. I can remember driving along and flushing like flocks of 10 or 20 clay-colored sparrows. They're that common out there, whereas we get ones and twos in southern Ontario. So a very common bird along the Rainy River roads. And there's other western species that people head out to Rainy River for. They have to get a little more lucky. This is a western kingbird, and again, one of my photos, as you can tell. But I took this photo in Rainy River on my very first trip there. We were driving along, and we spotted this guy on a wire. They have bred in the Rainy River area. They actually bred in 2020, but most years they don't. Most years they're just there as sort of a vagrant. But I mean, they're much more common, or you're much more likely to encounter one as a vagrant in Rainy River than anywhere else in the province. And of course, like any good birding location, there's a sewage lagoon in town. And this photo, again, one of mine. But from the photo, you can see there's a whole lot of little birds, and they're swimming around. And they're not ducks. These are actually Wilson's phalaropes. And Rainy River is just on the edge of the core range of Wilson's phalaropes. And so they get flocks like this, like 20, 30, 40, 50, even hundreds of Wilson's phalaropes that pass through in migration. So much different than southern Ontario, again, where we get excited for ones and twos. Now, I've been talking about all these western birds, and that's definitely what is the main draw for birders to head to Rainy River. But I think what makes Rainy River such a cool place for birding is it's got this real mix of birds. So it's got all these western birds, but then it's also got birds from the boreal forest, birds of the north. And I mean, what more sort of iconic bird from the north do you have than the great gray owl? And great gray owl is a year-round resident in the Rainy River area. You can definitely find them in the winter, but you can also find them breeding there even in the summer. And I can remember a trip about 10 years ago. This really memorable morning, getting up really early. We were birding. Ken and our friend Alvin and we were birding the Rainy River area, and we got up early and we found some sharp-tailed grouse in a field. So we were really happy with that. And then literally like the next field over, we found a great gray owl. So it's a pretty special moment, pretty special morning of birding, to get great gray owl and sharp-tailed grouse, and we got all these other fantastic Rainy River specialties while we were there. So really cool mix of the west and the north. But then to sort of throw it over the top, you've also got birds from the south, which is just really really bizarre mix. So I already talked about yellow-throated vireo when I was talking about the Port Stanley to Port Burwell chapter, and it's sort of most birders would think of it as a southern Ontario bird, but they also not only they're in southern Ontario, kind of from sort of like Barrie and Peterborough south, and then if you wanted to see a yellow-throated vireo again, and you were driving, you'd have to drive all the way along the north shore of Georgian Bay, go through Sault Ste. Marie, drive around Lake Superior, go through Thunder Bay, and then make it all the way out to Rainy River, and then all of a sudden you get yellow-throated vireos. And it's the same thing with red-headed woodpeckers and purple martins, and there's this long list of birds that show back up in Ontario when you get to this little sliver of Rainy River. So it's this amazing mix of north meets south meets west, all jam-packed in this tiny little triangle of Ontario. So it's definitely a must-go place for all birders in Ontario at some point in their lives. All right, so we've got one more chapter, and that's the furthest north chapter we have in the book. It's the Moosonee area and southern James Bay. So this map is showing the town of Moosonee and Moose Factory on the island in the Moose River. And as you can see, there's a railway, and that's how you get to Moosonee. And I always like to tell people one of the best parts of birding Moosonee and southern James Bay is actually getting there. It's a long way. From southern Ontario, you're going to drive for 7 or 8 or 9 hours, depending on where you're leaving from. You're going to drive through North Bay, and several hours further, you go through New Liskeard, and then halfway from New Liskeard to Cochrane, you pass into the Arctic watershed, which is such a cool part of the drive. And so you've got to stop and have your picture taken, and then you head on for another hour or so, another couple hours to get to Cochrane. So you'll have to stay overnight in Cochrane, most likely, because to go any further, you've got to get on the train. And the train only goes once a day. So you unless you left at like midnight, you'll probably have missed the morning train. So you can stay overnight in Cochrane, and then you catch the train the next morning. And the train ride is tons of fun as well. We always sort of spend the ride with your faces plastered up against the windows, staring out, watching the boreal forest stroll by, and you eventually come to some of these huge rivers like the Moose River here, and you're keeping an eye out all the time for birds, of course. You might see some Canada jays from the train. We're always looking for flocks of sharp-tailed grouse. And remember I told you this was a prairie species. Well, there's actually two types of sharp-tailed grouse, two subspecies. You've got the prairie subspecies, and then you have another subspecies that's found in the boreal forest, which is found in these really sort of stunted muskeg areas. So if you're lucky, you'll see some flocks of sharp-tailed grouse. Most likely, if you get them, it's a little flock of them that's flushed off the tracks as a train comes. Now, the sort of target bird on the train ride is the northern hawk owl or great gray owl, and you got to get really lucky for these guys. And it seems to be, no matter what, anytime we've been birding, doing the train with other birders, without fail, if we see an owl, a hawk owl or a great gray owl, there's always somebody that's gone to the bathroom. So make sure you don't go to the bathroom during the train ride, because you're pretty much guaranteeing your friends will get to see an owl and you're going to miss it. So, but in all seriousness, this is definitely a bird to keep an eye out for, usually up on the tops of a little spruce, or as you get along to the area with the telephone poles, the utility poles, watch for them perched up there. Now, when you arrive to Moosonee, remember I said the town of Moosonee is on the mainland, and then Moose Factory is on the island. You can take a water taxi to get over to the island. Birding is really great in town. You can get all sorts of northern things like Canada jays, boreal chickadees, three-toed woodpeckers, blackback woodpeckers, spruce grouse. The Sewage Lagoon always has some interesting birds, ducks or shorebirds. But if you really want to experience the coast, you've got it. The part of the province you want to get out to the actual coast of James Bay. And the easiest way to do that, it's not that cheap though, but the easiest way to get out there is to take a helicopter. And I've been lucky enough to be on a few trips, some for fun, but some for work, doing shorebird surveys and things like that. This photo here is us getting ready to do a trip at the start of November in 2011. So you can see we've got bags and bags of warm blankets and boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of chili to stay warm, because it was cold there in early November. But up in the air, you get a sense of the landscape. James Bay is very shallow, and so even though even small changes in the tides, there are tides. Remember, it's salt water here, and it's attached to the Arctic Ocean, so we've got tides, and even little tides create kilometers of mudflats, which make this a really important staging area for shorebirds. And some of the work that I've been able to do is looking for shorebirds in some of these areas. This is a camp that I stayed at in 2014, I think it was. And in this camp, we were actually about a kilometer from the coast. The coast is way up here. But these are hunt camps from the Moose Cree, the local indigenous community, and they rent them out to the researchers doing the shorebird surveys. And this camp was super sweet. As you can see, it's got a little observation tower that lets you see over top of these sort of willow thickets. Now around camp, it's pretty cool. A totally different set of birds than we see in southern Ontario. This is a young northern shrike that came into camp, and it was sort of hunting yellow warblers and common redpolls, which that alone is pretty cool to see northern shrikes and yellow warblers at the same time, or yellow warblers and common redpolls for that matter. One of the most common species of songbirds here is actually the Nelson sparrow. They breed in the salt marsh that is all around the area. So super cool to see this species that we get really lucky. We have to get really lucky to see one or two of in southern Ontario, but here they're quite abundant. But the real reason we're here is for shorebirds, counting them and seeing how many of each species there are, basically. It's possible that as many as 2 million shorebirds stop on southern James Bay each fall. And that is a just absolutely stunning number. So the flights of shorebirds was pretty spectacular. This photo, even though it's not in focus, I tried counting it once, and there's actually about 1,000 shorebirds flying by. And this was part of a flight each sort of day at high tide. The shorebirds would fly by, going to a area where they could sort of wait out the high water. Some of the most abundant species are things like the semi-palmated sandpiper, but we even saw pretty spectacular numbers of Hudsonian godwits as well. This is part of a flock of hundreds and hundreds of Hudsonian godwits. And what was really cool, as this flock flew by, we could see another flock of Hudsonian godwits to our south, and another flock like this to our north. And we estimated that we saw about 2,000 or 3,000 Hudsonian godwits that day, which is it's about a 3 or 4% of the estimated world population of the species. So absolutely incredible numbers, and very, very significant for conservation of these species, not just for an Ontario perspective, but for a global perspective. Now back to that cold trip in early November. This was us on what we thought was our last day. That's Ken bundled up behind his telescope. We thought it was our last day, but as it turned out, the helicopter didn't come, so we got an extra day. But you can see we had all our gear out ready to get picked up. And it was a really cool birding trip, not just weather-wise, but bird-wise too. To be on James Bay as it's sort of starting to freeze up. You're seeing these last few shorebirds and ducks. We saw gyrfalcons a couple times. We'd see snowy owls regularly flying by, migrating. Huge numbers of redpolls and lots of pine grosbeaks and snow buntings. It was a fantastic trip. We saw lots of neat birds. But one of the highlights was actually not a bird. It was this little ringed seal, and it looks like this is in the middle of the ocean, but it's actually in a little pool, not much bigger than a big kitchen table. And this guy was like a kilometer from the bay. What had happened is it got stuck at low tide, and remember I said the mudflats there can be huge at low tide, and sure enough, this little ringed seal got stuck at low tide and just hunkered down in this little pool until the water came back, which was really great for us because we got to walk right up to it and see a seal in Ontario, 5 feet away, which can't say that too many people get that opportunity. So just absolutely awesome. That whole trip was great, and Southern James Bay and Moosonee again. Like all these places I've mentioned, really you got to do it eventually. If you're interested in birds or nature in Ontario, these are just fantastic places to see. So that's my virtual tour. Now, I wanted to end with this slide, and a lot of you will recognize this place. It's a place, unfortunately, we didn't get to visit this past year, but I know a lot of you recognize this as the tip of Point Pelee, or at least you didn't get to visit it last spring. And when I'm giving the presentation in person, I like to ask people what they see, and everybody always says, "Oh, it's birders," and that's true. But what's really cool is what all these people are doing, and there's actually only a couple people in this photo that are looking at birds. What most of them are doing they're just having a good time birding. It's such a fun hobby. But what I love at Point Pelee is as soon as somebody's not looking at a bird, everybody starts talking. And you don't have to be at Point Pelee for this to happen. It happens everywhere where there's birders congregating. They start talking to each other, and they start exchanging notes and telling people their highlights from the day before, asking them if they saw this rare bird or that rare bird. But as soon as birders get together, they start sharing that information. Birders are such a generous group of people, and Ken and I have been so lucky that we were able to become birders at such a young age, and the birding community was always just so willing to tell us little tips and tricks and give us all their secrets. And of course, Ken and I then went and copied all those secrets and put them into the book. So it's really, I just wanted to take that opportunity to thank everybody who's a birder for helping Ken and I put together our book. We hope that if you've got a copy, you've enjoyed it. You can give yourself a pat on the back for your contributions to it. But above all, I wanted to just say thanks, and thank you for for sitting through the presentation tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be happy to take any questions if you have them. Thank you.